thank you for joining. Okay. Okay. I was waiting for that. So what we're going to do today is to discuss the psychology of Israel society as a side to the conflict with the Palestinians. This is usually not how people discuss the conflict, because usually people discuss the history, or as Ruby would discuss the issue of law, and this is extremely important. But I find that usually the issue of the influence of Israeli society's shared collective perceptions, thoughts, and emotions on individuals and on the conflict is usually less discussed. So this is what I want to do today, and I think it's quite interesting because usually, again, it's not something that is on people's mind. I just say, Jenny asked me to say a few words by myself. I think she already said a couple of things. I would just say that I'm a lawyer trained in human rights. And because I wanted to do things with the conflict, I went to work with the Bereaved Families Forum, Israeli-Palestinian organization, which I guess some of you know quite well. Was working then there on research, mainly in development of projects. And I realized I know very little about the subject I'm discussing and working on. So I went and done my PhD on the conflict, the psychology of Israeli society, and the Supreme Court. And later I began today is by saying the following. So I start with that. I think in order to understand the conflict, we have to think about the psychology of the conflict. In order to resolve the conflict, Ruby, I have to say that as an ex-human rights lawyer, in order to resolve the conflict, you have to have a legal solution. So while I firmly believe this is very important, which is psychology of conflict is really, really important, in order to resolve it, we have to turn to Ruby. So this is our next session, and I do believe Ruby will have other things to discuss before we turn to the issue of how to resolve the conflict. So without further ado, let's start me sharing this one. Okay. Okay. Let's think about this headline, which is quite recent, and keep that in the back of our mind when we go over the slides, and we return to that in a couple of minutes, hopefully more than 10. So the Israel-Palestinian conflict is that this is an intractable conflict. Intractable conflict is usually something that we don't know a lot about, because it's usually discussed with regard to conflict resolution. Intractable conflict is basically what we know about the conflict in Israel, but let's be more specific. So it's long, it's very long, it's protracted, it's lasting more than a generation, it's violent. It's important because the violence is throughout the conflict. In some respects, it's different than the Second World War, because just think, very few people died in comparison, but they died throughout the last century. There's no such thing as a quiet year. Throughout the last century, there was always Arab, Palestinians, Jews who died because of the conflict. Another thing, which obviously relates to what I just said, is perceived as irresolvable, given the violence, the prolonged period in which it continues, which is more than 3 generations, maybe 4 generations. Both sides do not think the conflict has a chance to be resolvable. It's also total, which means it's not something which is minimal. It's basically everything is involved in that. It's also central. So it's not a minor thing. It's on people's mind all the time. And as we just said, it's perceived as zero sum, or maybe we haven't said exactly that, meaning that any gain but by one side is perceived immediately as the other side's loss. So we basically cannot imagine a peace resolution of the conflict, peaceful resolution, because both sides would argue that if the other side wants to sign on to a peace deal, that supposedly suggests that it is bad for us to sign. That's quite hard to think about. It's quite depressing. But this is how intractable conflicts are observed in research. I would like also to add that I've taken out all the academic sources. Everything that I'm going to say, most of it, is backed by a lot of research. And so if somebody is interested, I can send you other, papers and various recommendations for books if somebody is interested in going to further depths. So given what we know about intractable conflicts and about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, we realize that members of societies, both Israeli society and the Palestinian society, experience fear, pain, and guilt throughout their time life. There's not a single person, there's not a single human being living today that remembers a peaceful period between Jews and Arabs, Palestinians and Israelis. So that prolongedness of the conflict permeates fear, pain, and guilt and other negative emotions. And those negative emotions need to heal. People could not continue to feel fear, pain, and guilt. It's too much for an individual. It creates significant amount of mental stress. And the issue with intractable conflicts, and this is perhaps the most important thing I have to say today, is they are metabolized by social defense mechanisms. So to keep it simple, people suffer under intractable conflict. Both sides suffer. In order to suffer less, in order to be able to function, we have to do something with that. As individuals, what Freud told us is that we have developed psychological defense mechanism. Social psychology tells us about something different, about social defense mechanisms, which are involved in lessening individual suffering. So you turn towards the individual, but you use society in order to protect individuals against very difficult negative emotions. So societies in intractable conflicts share a worldview of cognitions, emotions, beliefs, which are acting in unison as social defense mechanisms. And I'm hoping this is not too theoretical, but shared social defense mechanism could be arguably perceived as three separate things: shared beliefs, which is the ethos of conflict, which is how we see reality as of now, what's happening around us. The other thing is collective memory, which we'll discuss soon, and shared emotional rotations, which is how we as a society feel the same, being on the same page emotionally, not only. So let's start with the first one, which is as a member of society, an all-encompassing framework to think about the conflict. So emotions, beliefs, and thoughts of members of society in intractable conflict are shaped by the ethos of conflict, which is not a singular thing, it's plural, but this is how we connect things under the same roof of ethos of conflict. And let's go into, I just want, before we go into depth, we are going to say something important, which is political beliefs are not ethos of conflict, because we see that people, both on the right, on the left, believe the same things. So it's not as if you can say those on the right have the ethos of conflict and those on the left have less of that. it's not exactly as simple as that. So just very, very minimally, we do have to go into depth with regard to ethos conflict. So ethos of conflict is usually perceived as a cluster of beliefs, and clusters with regard to the following 5 points are perhaps the most important, which is beliefs about our own justness, the justness of our own goals. As you can imagine, Zionism, thinking about the need to have a state following the Holocaust, is also a way for us to understand the justness of our own goals. And obviously, Palestinians have a mirror image. They can also tell their own story and can justify their own goals. Security. Security is so important, not only physical security, but also the belief that security, national survival is important. What we see is how security is permeating all strands of society. We can talk about security with regard to basically anything, and this is very visible today, but it's also visible in different time, common time. Another thing is number 3 is society and beliefs of positive collective self-image. Because we are involved in a very violent conflict, both sides are involved in killing, in various violent actions. And what we have to do in order to sustain a self-image of rightfulness, in order to feel better about ourselves, is to perceive that in a social manner. So it's not for each and every one of us to develop a positive self-image of themselves. It's through that societal beliefs that we can feel part of a just society, as a positive society, which is good, which is not bad. I'm talking the most basic things. Another very important part is victimization. Again, it's very hard to discuss it right now. This is why this presentation is something I basically started anew from and just wrote it, because we are in a very different period in what we were, say, a year ago. But victimization, even before what we endured in the last half year, was always there, was always present. And both sides to the conflict perceive themselves as the ultimate victim. And that connects very well to the last thing I'm going to discuss, which is the legitimization of the other, of the opponent. So if I'm the victim, obviously there's somebody who victimizes me, and that's the opponent. For Israeli society, again, now it's something we discuss later on, it's obvious that the victimizer is the Palestinians, but it was always the case. Even during Oslo, before that, it was always the case that Israeli society believed the Palestinian is the ultimate oppressor, and it's always the same thing on the Palestinian side. They also believe that they are their own victim, and the other side, the Israelis are the oppressors. So this is quite complicated. I'll try to do it very, very rapidly. This is a new poll conducted a few months ago, and it asked a very interesting question. It asked Jews what they think about Arab and vice versa with regard to support for peace. And you can see that Jews do not believe there's a lot of Arabs that support peace. They basically say very few Arabs support peace, and 54% of Jews believe Arabs are very much opposed to peace. Let's just leave the Arabs alone for a moment. Just think about how that relates to the ethos of conflict. We see that Israeli society, the Jews in Israeli society, believe the Arabs do not want peace. Let's go back and return to the issues that we mentioned. This is Jews that want to think, they are just, they are moral. The other side is to blame. We are victims. We don't have peace because of Palestinians, not because of us. And this is, again, a new poll, independent of what we've discussed. And I think there's enough to say about the comparison between Arabs and Jews, but we won't go to that because we won't have time. Collective memory is something else. Collective memory is how we perceive the past. And this map can tell us a lot. This is a map that is intended for children. Pick that from the internet, obviously. And there's something interesting about this map. It is a map that never were. There's nothing here that actually existed in any period of time, because there's Jordan. This is the mandatory borders of Jordan. So present-day Jordan. And the map discusses the history. So biblical time and current time are mashed together in a way that was never there in reality. And this is collective memory. So we perceive reality and the past, a very, very limited prism, which serves the ethos of conflict and those beliefs we mentioned, which is, for example, belief in our right, our just right for land. So what we see in this land, in this map, obviously, we are very minimal in our demands for the whole of Israel, because we actually also should have Jordan. In order to lighten up, I guess, the atmosphere, this is something I was circulating Facebook, I think a decade ago, which somebody had just took a picture of a poster in Israel, in Israeli primary school. And I think it speaks for itself. You can see Arabs, Nazis, Haman, Greeks, and Pharaoh. Everyone is mashed together, and it all leads to the same conclusion. We need a state. So I don't have a problem with that, but I have a problem with, it looks to me that it's, again, not really how things are. It's much more nuanced. But here we create a very specific collective memory, which is not action memory, but it's a way for us to perceive memory in order to support the ethos of conflict. Okay, so there's a question here. I won't open that because we are running out of time, but this is my favorite slide by far. We have a sieve and we have a fish of sorts. And why do we have them? Because shared societal beliefs are both a sieve and a lens, a distorted lens. What we have in a very violent and protracted conflict is a need to protect ourselves, because reality, data that comes through, needs to be limited. We cannot perceive, for example, ourselves as those who are oppressors. For present day, unfortunately, when Israeli is in Gaza and obviously involved in violent affairs, it's very hard for Israelis to perceive whatever is going there. And this is why perhaps in Israeli television, you don't see a lot of pictures from Gaza. So we have two mechanisms. We have the sieve that limits our access to information, and we have that lens that distorts whatever goes and reaches us. It's important, again, to say this is going on in all intractable conflicts, and it's the same thing, the same mechanisms that operate in the Palestinian society. The problem is that those mechanisms lead both societies to reinforce a divide between us and them, and to narrow perspectives and foster resistance to compromise and dialogue. And this, if this is not clear, let's move forward, and hopefully that would become clear as we progress. What happens when you have a society which is steeped in an intractable conflict? Supposedly, we would like to believe that people can choose their own beliefs and perceptions, and can have their own individual thoughts about the conflict. But when we look at the enormity of shared beliefs and perceptions, which we've already discussed, what we find that it's very, very hard for individuals to keep a very separate view of what society has. So there are different shades of red here, but society as a whole consists of individuals that are very much in unison with regard to their perceptions and beliefs regarding the conflict. This is quite, I think, easy to see in both sides. The Palestinians, if you choose to look at the Palestinian society, it's there. If you are able to do that to your own society, if you're an Israeli, you would see that it's very similar. It's very, very hard to find, especially obviously now, people who look at things from a different perspective. I'm not saying it is wrong or right. What we're trying to do here is to go beyond right and wrong, but look at how things are. What's reality? How people react to that reality. The reality, obviously, we know. How people react to that is what we came here to discuss. So we began, Ruvi and I and Jenny, we began to look at the issue of occupation. And this lecture should have been all about the occupation. And I ended up with a single slide about the occupation. Why so? Because occupation with regard to psychological aspects of the conflict is more of the same. It's a heightened view of the ethos. If Israeli society is an occupier, and as Ruvi would discuss, it's a legal issue. But if it is an occupier, psychologically, it's a further burden. So as we mentioned, each society, an intractable conflict, is burdened by negative feelings. If you are, as a society, involved in killing of the other side, you would feel guilty. It's a matter of being a normal human being. If we are involved as a society with killing of others, we would feel terrible about it. And in order to lessen the guilt and pain, we have to come up with a different conception. So, for example, just think about the word, the term occupation in Hebrew, how difficult it was for many, many years to even discuss this word. As an academic or an ex-academic, I looked for courses in the Israeli academia that the title consists of the word occupation. I found that there is perhaps one. Myself, when I tried to teach about these issues, basically I was told, don't talk about the occupation, talk about the conflict. It's much easier for us to digest that, because with the word occupation comes a lot of negative connotations. So Israeli society, up until now, I mentioned that it's quite a mirror image of Palestinians just with regard to the psychology of the conflict. Here I want to break that dichotomy and to suggest something else. Israeli society, this is quite difficult to say, but Israeli society suffers more than Palestinians. I'm not talking about the recent events. I'm talking about the occupation. Psychologically speaking, the occupation is a burden. It's very, very hard for a society to believe in its own victimization, in its own justness of causes when you're continuing to be an occupier. This is not about the legal matters. This is about psychological matters. So very interesting papers were written about that a decade ago by some of my closest friends, and they basically suggested Israeli society suffers and Israeli society struggles psychologically because it knows it's an occupation, it's an occupier, society. And usually when we talk about the suffering with regard to occupation, we would talk about Palestinians. We talk about the psychology of both society. Those who suffer more are the occupiers. Psychologically, they have to go deeper and deeper into defense mechanisms in order to sustain a feeling of justness and moral perception on perception. For Palestinians, this is easier. Many other things are much, much worse. Nobody would like to be under military occupation. Nobody. But at least Palestinians find it very, very hard, easy up until what we've endured in the last half year. It was quite easy for Palestinians to feel better about themselves because it would have been easier for them to perceive themselves as victimized and as the victims because of the Israeli military occupation. So this is where I think a lot of people, when I talk about these issues, find it very hard to comprehend. And it's good. This is not the way people usually think about the occupation. And I think this is why it's interesting and important to look at the psychology beyond what we usually discuss. We usually look at the occupation from very different perspectives. Here I want to present the occupation as further burden on Israeli society, beyond what we have discussed and beyond what is normal to a society which is involved in intractable conflict. So one of the issues is also for a long time, the occupation continues. And this is something that Ruvi would discuss, I'm sure, because this has major significance with regard to international law, but it's also very important with regard to psychological influences on Israeli society. If the occupation was short, people would not feel that they need to dig deeper and to use massive defense mechanisms. If we think about the occupation, it is perhaps more than 2 generations right now. And this is very significant. It's no longer possible, in my view, to distinguish between the conflict and the occupation. The occupation runs for so many years. It basically drags Israeli society down, and it has to do a lot of things in order to relieve itself from a perception of a wrongdoer, of somebody who is a society which is unjust and immoral. So let's look at the issues we've discussed right now from a different perspective. Let's try to be positive. Let's ask ourselves, okay, there's a problem with the ethos of conflict, there's a problem with what is shared through society, but how can we transform that? How we can move forward? And one of the most prevalent ways peace organization work out how to react to a conflict is through joint activities. So there are a few articles written about those dialogue meetings, those activities that usually involve young Israelis and Palestinians. Set of research was done by the late and great Dan Baron. I was very fortunate to work with him. And he was a psychologist from Beersheba University, Ben-Gurion University, and he created those very lengthy and extensive academic courses in which both Israeli and Palestinian students were working together to create constructive and peaceful dialogue and to understand the point of view of the other side. And what happened is that when the course ended, emotion changed, and cognition and beliefs changed dramatically. And this was observed by research conducted by Dan Baron and his fellow researchers. So there was an opening, there was something that happened. There was a change. People could work beyond the ethos of conflict. People could see that the other side is not that awful victimizer, that awful oppressor. There's something more than that. But as I mentioned here, eventually people would return to the base positions and would return to the shared societal beliefs, the ethos of conflict. Why? because in society, such as the Israeli and also the Palestinian society, we have a very strong sense of social integration or reintegration. We have a very close family and social connections. And when you have somebody who returns or changes his views with regard to the other side, with regard to the conflict, eventually discussing those issues with friends and family, those people will return to those beliefs that are shared by their peers, by their family members. So this was actually, there was a formula created by Dan Baron to when those things happen. Let's suppose 2 weeks pass, those people still maintain a very different perspective on the other side, on the conflict. But when you think about 2 years that pass, you see that there's nothing changed, that any change was temporary, which is quite upsetting for those of us who believe in dialogue, and I'm sure most of us do believe in dialogue, as a way to resolve the conflict. What I'm saying here again is something that is quite, I think, difficult for many to hear, because it basically says what we are doing, some of us are thinking about helping or achieving that or saying that this is the way forward. This might not be the way forward. I want now to use my time, the last minutes that I have, to discuss this period. So let's start with something optimistic. We began by looking at this headline, which is quite recent. So even though there's a war, Israel is still one of the happiest places on earth. People believe that they are happy, that society is a happy place, and there are various factors that goes into that chart, this data. It is used actually by the United Nations. It's not a private initiative. This is the United Nations checking that interesting way to look at societies. So when I thought about that, I said to myself, it's very odd, because for us, I think most of us view society, Israeli society, is more divided right now than perhaps any other period in the past. So how do you connect those very contrasting data? And I think in order to understand that schism, you have to return to what we discussed just a couple of minutes ago, which is the shared societal beliefs, and to understand that they have a crucial role to play with regard to both societies, because they maintain group cohesion. They give both sides an identity and provide a sense of security. So if you think about the shared societal beliefs, you see how they can create happiness, because you feel you are supported by your own society. You're not alone in the world. So even though we think of the Israeli society as divided, and perhaps it is, there's also more nuanced view, which is Israel still is a place people feel happy to relate to connect to. And for me, looking at very interesting data, I find myself going again and again to what I know about the ethos of conflict, the psychological impact of the conflict on Israeli society, which is creating cohesion, identity, a sense of pride, a sense of moral justness, and security, which is also very important. So all these things are very prevalent in Israeli society as of now, and were so before. I'm sure when you think about it, you realize that you know what I'm talking about. It's quite easy to see how, as a society, Israel has a lot in common. People believe in the same ideas, and people adhere to the same notions, even though we now know that we are very divided. And also, obviously, those of us who don't share those beliefs are not really happy right now. So I want to move toward the end of this very short presentation, which is based on a course I gave in the Hebrew University. So you can imagine I can go on and on about each of those slides, and I've really given up on presenting many other issues. But for me, it was very interesting when I prepared this lecture or discussion to think about all those issues post October 7th. In a way, the worst thing that can happen to you is that what you perceive as just a myth or a fable becomes reality. So for many, the ethos was very rigid, and today it's reality because Palestinians have raped, have kidnapped, have murdered more than 1,000 Israelis. So it's very easy to see why Israelis perceive Palestinians as vicious. And many compare them to Nazis. There's good reason for that. And we can also understand why our perception as the helpless victims, as the only victim, the singular victim of the conflict, which perhaps was very dichotomous and perhaps not very accurate when we think about it, those people who are here, it's very hard to say to that, this is wrong, because this is actually what happened. It's still happening. We have people who are kidnapped, and they're young, some of them, obviously most of them, or all of them, civilians. And so you feel immediately they are civilians, they're really not part of the immediate conflict. And unfortunately, all those things that I mentioned before as distorted, as limited, all those issues are now part of reality. Those existential threats that we imagined as just not really correct have materialized. There was an existential threat. We now know that. So I think for those people who are here, we can say that we have noticed before October 7th that not every Palestinian wants war, not every Palestinian is the oppressor. Some Palestinians are actually victims. And us as Israelis are not really victims all the time. We can also be the oppressors. And this is basically a wake-up call, what we see in the last half year. We are feeling betrayed. We have been betrayed by Palestinians because we imagine that there's a nuance. Not all of them are Hamas, not all of them are bad. It's very hard not to feel enraged by the massacre. It's very hard to stand up and say those shared societal beliefs are wrong. It's very hard for people not to feel the desire for revenge, even though we would describe ourselves, many of us, I guess, as peace-seeking individuals. And it's very hard for us to hold on to those two notions, how we feel today and how we perhaps imagined we are throughout most of our lives, which is we feel that we can see the nuances of the conflict. We can realize perhaps that not Israeli society is not always just, not always moral, but today we have seen a collapse. We have seen how all these ideas that we tried to negate came back to haunt us. And perhaps the worst thing that happened to Israeli society is most of us, perhaps all of us, lost our ability to empathize with the suffering of Palestinian civilians, which is tragedy. It's very, very sad, obviously, because there's a lot of suffering going on right now. But even if we distance ourselves from the immediate reality, A society that has a problem empathizing with suffering, with human suffering, is a society which experiences breakdown. Societies need to be able to allow their members to think, to empathize with those who suffer, even if they suffer due to violence that we are involved in. So unfortunately, what we see after October 7th are very radical changes in Israeli shared perceptions. No longer can we distinguish between them and reality, which is what I try to do for the first half hour of this discussion. And I think we're really running late. So I just want to end to be optimistic and also to try to relate to what I guess we'll see Ruby discuss in 2 weeks' time, which is another thing I was very fortunate to learn about as a high white individual in the back there near Desmond Tutu. His name is Alex Burain. He was the co-chair of the Truth and Reconciliation South African Commission, and he was also my teacher. And I was very happy to spend a lot of hours with him and to hear about the road to reconciliation, the way they transformed from apartheid to democracy. And look at the sign, which is so important. The tagline was, "Truth is the road to reconciliation." So in a way, I return to my earlier years as a human rights lawyer, saying, in order to resolve a conflict, we may need to lessen the discussions of dialogue and reconciliation and talk more legalese about rights and about the way we perhaps deal with international law, which we don't really do right now. So thank you so much for listening, and I think this is a good place to stop.
Thank you, Ofer. So like I said, feel free to write your questions on the chat. You can also use the raise hand button. There was a question earlier. In what way is that psychological burden of occupation visible or noticeable in Israeli society? Aren't these defense mechanisms strong enough to protect them from psychological damage? It seems that those who do keep a different color from the rest of society get extremely vilified and regarded as traitors.
Should I answer or should we open up?
Go. I think go ahead. Yeah.
I think there's absolutely no way to not notice how Israel is burdened by the occupation. I think the burden of the occupation is very prevalent in all aspects with regard to Israeli society. I think the issue that began discussion between Ruvi, Jenny, and myself was whether Gaza was occupied before October 7th. And the difficulty to relate to the possibility that perhaps it was suggests that Israelis have limitation to what they can accommodate. It's the same with regard to the occupation that is in the Judea and Samaria, West Bank. And we see for many, many years, Israelis were adamant not to call Palestinians, Palestinians, to call occupation, occupation. It did change, I have to say, for the better. But for many years, even those terms were basically written off, and Israeli schools were disallowed to mention occupation. And as I mentioned before, still I think, Ruby would correct me, but I think it's not something that we hear more in the Israeli academia, which is discussions of occupation and the legal and moral costs of the continued occupation.
Ruvi?
Yeah, can I jump in for a second? So thank you firstly, Ofer, for this. I think it was both sobering and also incredibly informative, and so and actually a good segue to some of the things I'll say in the meeting on the 30th. But yeah, I'm wondering, and that was my comment in the chat as well, kind of as a follow-up to Maya's comment, whether one of the defense mechanism is an attempt to deny it. So obviously with relation to Gaza, and I'll talk about this as I said earlier, prior to October 7th, there were at least plausible, although not convincing in my view, legal arguments as to why the occupation has ended when Israel disengaged. But obviously there's no plausible argument in relation to the West Bank, right? And even the Israeli state has, by definition, recognized it by not annexing or by failing to annex most of the territory. But having said that, what I have noticed is that even supposedly lefty spaces like Haaretz, right, arguably the most lefty newspaper within the country, if you look at the weather map on the backside of Haaretz, not only is there no green line marked on it, it uses settlements as the spaces in the West Bank. So the difference in Haaretz's map and the map that you were displaying is actually less great than we would think. So I think that feeds into. So I don't think it undermines your point at all, because it feeds into that very good description you've given about how all the individual conceptions can collapse into collective conception. It just shows how deep rooted the denial is, that even a newspaper that supposedly is hostile to the occupation effectively erases it from view. So I was just wondering what you think, I suppose, in the realm of solutions, how can this be changed? Because if a 16-year-old child never saw a map that actually had the green line on it in a school book, how would they even know there is one?
Ruvi, there's a secret government decision from 1967 to erase the green line. And this is why school maps in Israel do not have a green line. It's not a coincidence. It's actually a government decision that was unearthed a couple of years ago. So yes, it's manufactured. People are working hard on limiting our access to information. And Israeli society is very much cooperating with that, as you just mentioned. Haaretz is cooperating with that, because it's too hard, even for Haaretz, to consider a different option. So this is a great way to understand that you can be leftist, but you still, in the end, perceive reality through that very narrow and distorted lens of the ethos conflict.
Yeah.
We have a question from Ariel, who is raising their hand.
Please.
Hi. Yeah, no, this is Mikal, Ariel's mom. I'm using his laptop. So first, thank you. It was really, really interesting, and I really like the analogy between psychology of individual to psychology of society. And I think about, what you say, that from a psychological perspective, the oppressor or the occupier actually suffering more because of the conflict and the guilt. But I'm thinking about defense mechanisms also when you think about individuals. They're there because they're defending us, right? They're there, they help us to actually live with reality in a way that actually protect us. And actually in psychology, there are many times they're very helpful to have, to be with defense mechanisms. And I'm thinking about the kind of the statement that we're suffering as because we're the oppressors as Israelis, but I think our defense mechanisms are pretty strong, and they actually protect us. And the research about happiness, even more kind of emphasize that as a society, unfortunately, I don't see the conflict you're talking about. I would actually argue that if we were able in any way to remove these defense mechanisms and raise the conflict, this is probably the way to change, because as you say, it's really hard to live with a constant conflict about, who we are. So I think my question is, if you kind of compare between society and individuals, what's the therapy that you need to take as society in order to realizing the age that is needed?
So I have two answers. First of all, it's really interesting your comments. One of them is look at psychology of the individual and think how you start with individuals who have defense mechanisms which are abnormal. Klein has written about that, others, Winnicott and others, and there are solutions, but the problem is obviously that you can't really take them and utilize them with regard to societies. And because of that, and because of what you mentioned, and because the effectiveness of those societal mechanisms that allow Israeli society to be a very oppressive, militant occupation, to continue to do that for generations, I think the way forward has to be through international law. Which is, for me, it's really strange because I basically escaped that part of my life and went to think about psychology and even went to write psychoanalytical papers on the conflict. But now, when we think about the gravity of the situation, I think the answer is perhaps to know what we're up against and to look at mechanisms which are legal, which can be forced or enforced on society. Because if we look at the grassroots movement that I was part of, it failed. It failed. Whatever people have done, and some of the best people were and still are working on peace and reconciliation, they all failed. When we think about it, there's a reason they failed. It's not because they are, amateurs, they're professionals, but it's irresolvable. If you think about intractable conflict, what I remember most when I thought about it, and I mentioned the person whose name is Coleman, who's teaching in Columbia University, and he says the best way to resolve an intractable conflict and make sure it would not become as prolonged as intractable conflicts. If you are in the midst of a conflict, try to resolve it as soon as possible, because when it reaches around 30 years, which is a generation, you end up with people who have no idea what peace is and they don't aspire to peace because they don't know what it means. It's not, none of us aspire to be on Mars because we don't know what it is. People do not have that possibility of looking beyond what they know.
Thank you.
There is a question from Boaz. How can we discuss truth when both sides are currently led by minority groups that hold extreme messianic beliefs?
I think this is wrong. I don't think we are led by messianic beliefs. I think we are led by the need for both societies to take care of their basic needs and to feel security. If you know a little bit about Maslow, those who know sociology or psychology, people have basic needs. Security is one of them. And those messianic crazies, those people protect Israeli society better than any leftist or politicians from the Meretz or whatever, because they protect Israelis from feeling those emotions that we cannot feel. you cannot feel the enormity of the guilt occupation creates. The only way to prevent that sense of moral collapse is to be Smotrich. Because Smotrich has an idea how to prevent that. He really believes in that. And he's messianic, that's true. But he is better than myself. I have nothing to offer Israeli society who would say to me, so what do you do? There's an occupation. It's supposedly a bad thing. And I have nothing to say. I cannot say, no, it's good. The only person who would heal the wounds of Israeli society has to be Messianic. It's very hard.
Yeah. So Jessica asked if there was research since October 7th about the social perception within Palestinian society and how it was affected or changed.
Yeah, I thought about that when I prepared this lecture. And eventually I decided not to go there because there might be some research, but it's very early. Academic research takes a lot of time. And those changes are very sudden. Those changes would be effective if we look at the same processes in 2 and 5 years' time. So this is too early to know. What I try to do is think about who's hurting more right now. And in my society, Israeli society, I think those who hurt more, to suffer more. And this is some of the earliest questions that we before the lecture. Those people who try to empathize with Palestinians, who try to look at Palestinians from more complicated people, now have a different set of ideas. And basically, reality seems to crush their prior beliefs. And I find this is very, very prevalent in groups, in WhatsApp group, for example, of people who are therapists, people who are leftists, people who tried to go beyond the occupation, to think creatively about resolution of the conflict. Those people suffer more than others because they also think that they have revenge and they have very difficult times to hang on and to latch on into that notion that we are not wholly victimized. We are also oppressors. It's very hard to say that after the massacre of October 7th.
So we have time for one more question, I guess. So if anybody has any questions, feel free to raise your hand or just write it down. Okay, or we can finish. Ofer, I don't know if you have any kind of last words that you want to share before we finish the session, or
I just want to say that I just want to thank everybody who came. I think this is not a very easy subject. It's not easy to hear about it right now. And it's not as if I have something very optimistic to say. But I try to be optimistic, saying that perhaps international law would be the ultimate savior of and the Palestinians.
Okay, thank you. Rovi, anything from you?
Not particularly. I mean, I think we'll, as I said, there are obviously themes that will come through when we talk next time. Yeah, I'm not sure I'm as optimistic about. I mean, I think the international law has potential. I think there are pushbacks against that for the same defense mechanism reasons, including the labeling of anything that is done internationally as anti-Semitism or terror, legal terror or lawfare. We've heard all of these terms, and they all intend to do precisely what has been successfully done internally within Israel, which was reflected in Maya's question. So that isn't to say that they don't hold promise. The reason they hold promise is that Israel has less control over what happens internationally than it does over what happens in its own school books. And so to that effect, there might be some cause for optimism, but I think a cautious one.
Okay, so something to look forward to in 2 weeks. And we will send a follow-up email to all of you with the link to sign up for the next session. Thank you, Gid, for joining us. Thank you, Ofer and Ruvi. And we'll see you in 2 weeks, hopefully. Have a good evening. Bye.
Have a good evening, everyone.
Bye-bye.